Okay, you guys, I'm going to walk you through this model of the brain, and all of the models in our lab have the same numbers on them, even if they look a little bit different. And there are some structures on here that are on your list that don't exactly have a number, or the number that we use for the structure is not actually what it says on the key, and that's just because we're not going to get quite as specific as that key does. So a lot of stuff we're just going to leave off entirely, and you won't use the numbers at all, but I'll go through the structures today that you will need to know for the brain. So if we start just looking at the brain as a whole, so all of these ridges and grooves that you see on here, most of the brain matter actually is going to be made up of the cerebrum. So all of this tissue that you're looking at right here is the cerebrum, and that is the part that we separate into, the cerebral cortex with the white matter and the gray matter. But for our purposes today, let's just kind of focus on getting to know the different parts of the cerebrum and then start to move to the inside of the brain and look at some of the structures in there. So generally speaking, it doesn't really matter what numbers that you write down for a few of these things, but for the cerebrum, just know that it's the entire thing. And then when you start looking at the hemispheres, so the hemispheres are, for the most part, thankfully going to be aligned with the bones that they sit on top of. So you're probably familiar with number 2 here is going to be the parietal hemisphere. And I don't think that you guys have this on your sheet, but the temporal lobe is going to be right below that. So parietal lobe, temporal lobe. The whole front of the brain is going to be the frontal lobe, up until the point where you get to the central sulcus, which your textbook has a picture of, and it's not quite as clearly marked on this brain, but it's really wherever you have this line, this sulcus going kind of straight down the side of the brain, separates the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. The occipital lobe, you can probably guess, is going to be on the back of the brain. And I'll try to kind of keep this in focus here as I go throughout these areas. So the occipital lobe, of course, just sits on the occipital bone. We move to this side of the brain. So there are a few numbers up here, 5, 6, and 7, and these are 2 different areas, but all you need to know is that you can put either 6 or 7 down for a gyrus. So gyri or gyri is going to be the plural form of that, and so a singular is just gyrus, and what that is simply a ridge. So you see that the cerebrum is made up of these ridges and grooves. So the grooves, like number 5, is going to be a sulcus, and plural form of that is going to be sulci. So you don't need to know all of these specific sulci, but there are quite a few of them, such as the central sulcus right here, that would separate different lobes of the brain. And then when you have really, really significant, a really significant sulcus, that is when we call it a fissure. So one example is going to be the longitudinal fissure that runs all the way up and down the brain right here. So that's the longitudinal fissure which separates the major hemispheres of the brain, so the right and left hemisphere of your brain. We have another fissure that also doesn't really have a number on it, so neither of these big fissures do, but they're very obvious portions of the brain. And the other one is going to be between the cerebrum and the cerebellum. So try to make sure you don't get these 2 areas mixed up, because a lot of the names kind of correspond with those areas. So this huge sulcus right here is the transverse cerebral fissure. And it's called cerebral fissure because it goes in between the cerebrum and the cerebellum. So again, cerebrum separated into the right and left hemispheres by that longitudinal fissure. You have the parietal lobe, which if we wanted to look at the numbers, it's going to be number 2. The temporal lobe is number 4. Occipital lobe is number 3. And then the frontal lobe, which the numbers right here, is going to be number 1. And so the frontal lobe is just this entire portion. There are a few structures that we can see on the underside of the brain, just looking at it from this angle. The first major one that I like to point out is this is the olfactory nerve. So number 1, the first nerve, and these Roman numerals on here do correspond with the cranial nerves. So if you kind of want to use the model to review the nerves in addition to just the parts of the brain, you can definitely do that. These are all correct on there. Number 8 is its own structure though, and that is the olfactory bulb. So still part of the nerve, and it's just this bulbous part at the end. The optic nerve sits right on top of the cranial nerve, and that's Roman numeral 2, which it's labeled way back in here. But where the optic nerves cross, and we talked about this in the lab, so they're going to cross so that the medial part of the nerves coming from both medial parts of your eyes can be sent to the other side of your brain, so that when you look to the left, your field of view, you're picking up the outside of your left eye and the inside of your right eye, so that all that information from, the left field of view is going to be sent to the left side of your brain. So we allow some of that crossover, and that crossing happens at the optic chiasma. So that X formed between the optic nerves crossing is called the optic chiasma. There's no number for that on here, just remember that it forms that X. This little gland hanging down right here, and on most of the models it's pushed to the side, and that's simply because it's attached with this wire and that kind of gets bent. It would be hanging down in the middle of the brain though, and so this is number 25, and this is the pituitary gland. We'll talk about that guy a lot more next semester if you take the the physiology heavy second semester of this course. But we can see a few other things on here which I might touch again when we open up the brain. So if we look kind of from this angle at the brainstem, you would have the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. The pons is the only number that you can see labeled right here, so the pons is number 36. The medulla oblongata, I'll show it to you again from another angle, it's going to be number 37. And we don't have you labeling the midbrain up here, but just be aware of what the 3 portions of the brainstem are. I think you answered a short answer question on your worksheet about what each of the sections kind of do, so just be aware of what those are. Let's go ahead and take a look now. I will show you the cerebellum because that's kind of another exterior portion of the brain that we can take a look at before we open it up. Okay, so I've pulled aside half of the cerebellum just so I could show you the interior of that. So letter D, this entire cerebellum is number 35, and then they just have letters associated with the parts of it. So letter D is going to be the arborvitae. The folia don't really have a number, but you're probably able to kind of pick up on these terms. So arborvitae kind of sounds like tree, right? So the tree and its branches are going to be the arborvitae, and the folia means leaves. So that's everything at the tips of the tree branches, right? And so the folia are actually going to be these ridges that you can see on the entire surface of the cerebellum. So I have a few letters that you can write down for that if you want to be familiar with that when you come back in to review the model. So A, B, and C, which are kind of around different parts of this portion of the cerebellum. You can write those down so you remember what the folia are. So arborvitae is the tree portion of the cerebellum, that branching portion of it, and then the folia, which are the leaves at the tip of the branches. I'll go ahead and open up the brain and we can take some look at the structures on the inside of it. Okay, so again, we can see the cerebellum and the brainstem a little bit better when we open it up. So just quick review, this is going to be the cerebrum, all of this tissue up here, cerebellum, which we've now opened up, and then the brainstem. So we're looking at everything cut down the middle. And so we would have the midbrain, the pons, which is this circular, kind of round egg-shaped portion of the brainstem, and then the medulla oblongata is going to be the portion down here. Pons, again, is number 36. Medulla oblongata is number 37. There's not a great number for the midbrain, so we usually don't have you label that, but around number 32 would be the midbrain if you kind of want to remember that for your own help. Another thing that I'll point out really quick that's part of the midbrain is the corpora quadrigemina, so kind of a tongue twister, and it is called something else on the key, this structure right here, but this is what I usually call the corpora quadrigemina, number 31 or number 13, whichever one you want to label there. And so if we put the brain together, these little white structures would be all attached, and there would be 4 bumps, which you can see a little bit better if you take off the cerebellum. But quad means 4, so 4 bumps, if you want to remember it that way. The corpora quadrigemina, which is part of the midbrain. If we look through the midbrain, we can also see the 4th ventricle, which you can label as number 34 or 35 is actually the 4th ventricle label. 34 is going to be usually what I label as the cerebral aqueduct, which drains the 3rd ventricle into the 4th ventricle, or connects them at least. So let's talk for a second about the ventricles. The ventricles are openings in the brain where cerebral spinal fluid can sit, essentially, or pool. And it is going to be really important because it helps bathe the cells in the brain and gets them nutrients and whatever they need. So it's a really important fluid in our brain. If we look at where the ventricles might be, it's going to be where you see any spaces. And so the really obvious space that you see first is this big one right here. And so this is the lateral ventricle. And so the other lateral ventricle would be on this side, but we have something covering it up on this side, and that is going to be the septum pellucidum. So this filmy looking thing right here, which they only show on half the brain because it's just this really thin layer that separates the 2 lateral ventricles. So you have 2 lateral ventricles, which would be ventricles 1 and 2. The 3rd ventricle is enclosed by the thalamus. So the thalamus is number 19, and it's pretty small on this model. Some figures show it looking a little bit bigger, but it is going to be this round structure that is somewhat hollow in the middle, except for this little bump right here, which would connect the nuclei in either side of the thalamus. But the 3rd ventricle is going to be around that same area. So enclosed by the thalamus would be the 3rd ventricle, which I don't think that there's a good label on here. But the hypothalamus is labeled, so number 21. If you want to give a label to the 3rd ventricle to kind of remember where it is, you could say it's between number 20 and number 22. But neither of those are technically the number of the 3rd ventricle, but it would kind of remind you of where it is. Number 26 is the choroid plexus of the 3rd ventricle. And what do you see when you look at this structure right here? Something unique that you don't see anywhere else on this model is this red and blue coloring. And that's because choroid plexuses are actually blood vessels that supply the cerebral spinal fluid, basically with extra nutrients. And so there's this pool of cerebral spinal fluid in each ventricle that is, communicating or providing fluid kind of back and forth between this choroid plexus, which is capillaries, blood vessels, so to and from the rest of the body, between that and the cerebral spinal fluid. Okay, I'm going to go through the rest of this fairly quickly because all of these are kind of the more obvious structures that will be pretty easy to see on a diagram. So number 10 is the corpus callosum, and that is this band that connects the 2 hemispheres, and it's going to be right above the lateral ventricles. The lateral ventricles do actually have a number, and it's number 16, but it would be kind of tucked up under this portion. So if you're looking for the lateral ventricles and you want a number, it is number 16. Again, the septum pellucidum is number 11, which separates the 2 lateral ventricles. The 3rd ventricle, again, doesn't really have a number, but it would be enclosed within the thalamus. Number 26 is the choroid plexus, so you can maybe write down between 20, 22, and 26 is the 3rd ventricle. So everywhere but this portion that sticks up is really where the cerebral spinal fluid would be sitting in the 3rd ventricle. The 4th ventricle is pretty easy to find. It's just this number, it's labeled right here on the inside of this, so it's number 35E technically. The cerebral aqueduct, which leads from the 3rd ventricle to the 4th ventricle, is number 34. The olfactory bulb, we already pointed out on the underside of the cerebrum. The optic nerve, if you didn't catch that, was number 2. The optic chiasma is just where those optic nerves cross and form an X, so there's no number associated with that. The thalamus is number 19. The hypothalamus, hypo just means under, right? So the hypothalamus is going to be number 21. And the pineal body is going to be number 23. So it's right next to that corpora quadrigemina. So 23 is the pineal body. Corpora quadrigemina is number 13 or 31, however you want to label it, because we're not using the more specific terms of what these structures are on the key. Again, pons is number 36, which is labeled on the side over here. Medulla oblongata is also labeled on the side, but that's number 37. The cerebellum, again, down here is number 35 with the different parts of it. The arbor vitae is letter D, and the folia I usually label as A, B, and C. And the pituitary gland, which is tucked back in here, is number 25. So let me know if you have any other, if I missed something on there, or if you have any other questions on this model, feel free to shoot me an email or ask me in class when we have some downtime someday.